Have you ever really looked at that classic image of Genghis Khan? You know the one I mean?
Oh yeah, the fierce warrior on horseback.
Exactly. The face that's kind of etched into our collective memory. He's the archetype of the Mongol conqueror, right? Founder of this massive empire that just reshaped Eurasia.
That's the standard picture.
Yeah, history books, movies, popular culture, they all consistently paint this picture. It's a figure, a force that seems to come purely from the East Asian steppes. You know, synonymous with what we think of as Mongolian in the most conventional sense.
It feels familiar,
Yeah.
comfortable almost.
Right. It feels like a bedrock piece of our historical understanding. But here's the thing. What if that picture, that widely accepted story, what if it's incomplete?
Ah, okay. So we're questioning the narrative.
We are, or rather, our sources are prompting us to question it. What if the history we've inherited isn't just a straight recording of facts? What if it's, well, more complex, maybe even curated?
History written by the victors, that sort of thing?
Or maybe, more accurately, shaped by the successor states, the ones who consolidate power after the initial storm, you know? What if, in the process of trying to make themselves seem legitimate, these later powers subtly, maybe even systematically, kind of, buried certain inconvenient truths about the founders?
That happens. Political expediency often shapes the historical record.
And that's the really intriguing possibility we're diving into today. We've got, well, quite a stack of source material here, specifically a re-examination of some genetic studies, ones that look beyond the most obvious markers.
Okay.
And we're coupling that with a critical look at some fascinatingly detailed historical accounts. So our mission, let's say, in this deep dive is to use these sources as our guide. We want to explore what they present as compelling and persistent evidence. Evidence that suggests a much more complex, maybe even surprising origin for Genghis Khan himself and his ruling Borjigin clan.
Right. It's not about just throwing out the established history.
No, not at all. It's not about tearing anything down or pushing, fringe theories. It's about meticulously looking at all the available evidence presented in our sources, especially the parts that often get overlooked or explained away or just don't quite fit the standard, neat narrative.
Using the full toolkit, genetics, and historical texts together.
Precisely. So I have to ask you, listening right now, have you ever found yourself pausing, even for a second, and questioning that neat, tidy picture history sometimes paints? Because our sources suggest there might be something pretty significant about the ancestry of the world's most famous conqueror that's been left unspoken, maybe deliberately obscured for a very, very long time.
And this is exactly why turning to things like genetic data, particularly Y-DNA, becomes so vital when you're trying to peel back those layers of historical narrative.
Because it's harder to manipulate.
Well, as the source we're looking at puts it, DNA offers what it calls incorruptible testimony. Now, that might be a strong phrase, but the point is, it's a record that isn't easily swayed by political needs or, the passage of time in quite the same way written histories can be.
Right.
It gives us a potentially more objective starting point to evaluate claims, even those that are really deeply embedded in how we understand the past.
Okay, so let's start with the standard genetic picture then. When geneticists look at populations that were, influenced by the Mongol Empire, and when this comes up in popular science or history docs, there's one specific Y-DNA haplogroup that always seems to dominate the conversation. That's C2, right?
C2, exactly. It used to be known as C3. Slightly different name, but C2 is the current term. Yeah.
And why C2? What's the connection?
Well, mainstream genetic studies, and this goes back, over 2 decades now, they identified this particular Y-DNA lineage, C2, as having a remarkably widespread distribution right across Asia.
Widespread how?
I mean, really widespread. What made it stand out was its relatively sudden appearance in many places and its rapid dispersal across huge territories. And that pattern lined up almost perfectly with the historical timeline and the geographical reach of the Mongol conquests back in the 13th century.
Okay, so the timing and location matched the empire's expansion.
Precisely. Because you find it in populations stretching from Eastern Europe right through Central Asia, deep into East Asia, basically, in areas that were once part of the Mongol Empire or were heavily influenced by it. So it gained a lot of traction as the most likely Genghis Khan cluster.
The genetic signature of the founder and his descendants spreading out.
That was the idea, the signature of his lineage spreading with the conquests.
And, I mean, on the surface, that seems perfectly logical, doesn't it? Genghis Khan conquered well, half the known world, his armies were incredibly successful.
Undeniably.
His soldiers, his commanders, they would have settled down, married local women, had kids, and those kids would have had kids, spreading their paternal genetic markers, their Y-DNA, across this enormous territory. So it seems pretty straightforward. C2 equals the genetic legacy of the Mongol expansion, probably stemming from the founder himself, or maybe his close male relatives who led the armies.
And that's precisely what our source material calls the simplistic interpretation of a complex reality.
Oh, okay. So too simple.
The source argues yes. While it is absolutely undeniable that haplogroup C2 is the genetic legacy of the horde, I mean, it was indeed spread by countless soldiers and their descendants across those vast territories. The source argues that focusing only on C2 and just labeling it the Genghis Khan lineage misses a crucial point.
Which is?
C2 became so widespread because of the sheer scale of the military success and the huge population movements driven by the empire. It represents the genetic impact of the armies, the millions of people who were either part of or fathered by men associated with the Mongol Empire as a whole entity.
I think I see the distinction you're making. It's a marker of the empire's footprint, the result of all that conquest and mixing. But does that necessarily mean it represents the exclusive original paternal line of Genghis Khan himself and his immediate elite family within the Borjigin clan before the empire became this massive, diverse thing?
Exactly. This is where the source introduces its central, really intriguing idea. It suggests this very widespread distribution of C2, while factually linked to the empire's success, could inadvertently function as a kind of genetic smokescreen.
A smokescreen? You mean like it's so big and obvious it actually hides something else?
Precisely that. The sheer numerical dominance and the broad spread of C2, representing that successful military expansion and subsequent integration, might actually be masking a different, perhaps rarer, possibly older paternal lineage.
A lineage specific to the Khan and his close family.
A lineage that might have been specific to the Supreme Khan himself and his immediate Borjigin family, before their genetic signature got potentially diluted or just overshadowed by the vast numbers of diverse peoples and soldiers incorporated into the rapidly growing empire.
So the success of the armies, which spread C2 everywhere, could ironically make it harder to spot the original Y-DNA of the ruling clan among people today if it happened to be something different.
That's the core argument. The success, in a way, obscures the origin point.
So, okay. While DNA provides that incorruptible testimony, as the source puts it, interpreting it, especially when you're dealing with these huge historical events and massive population movements, clearly requires a lot of nuance.
Absolutely.
You can't just point to the most widespread genetic marker associated with the empire's impact and automatically assume, that must be the unique lineage of the founder right back at the beginning. You've got to look deeper, consider other possibilities.
Precisely. You need to look beyond the most obvious, the most widespread signal, that genetic legacy of the horde, and start asking, what other less common or more localized genetic markers exist in the region? What might they tell us about older, more specific lineages, especially lineages that might have been associated with elite groups?
And this is the foundation of the source's challenge to the standard C2 narrative.
Exactly. It sets the stage for looking at alternatives.
Okay, so if C2 might be the legacy of the armies, the widespread impact, where does the source suggest we look for potential clues about the lineage of the Khan himself, the original Borjigin line?
Well, the source argues we need to look at the anomalies, the genetic outliers, the markers that are present in the Central Asia but don't really fit that dominant East Asian associated C2 story.
And does it point to any specific candidates?
It does. This is where the source zeroes in on specific Y-DNA haplogroups that have a really deep history in that part of the world. R1A and R1B.
R1A and R1B. Now, what's significant about those? They sound familiar, but not typically in an East Asian context.
You're right. They aren't the haplogroups you usually associate primarily with East Asian populations. Their significance lies in their typical association in genetic history. They are strongly associated with ancient Indo-European migrations across the Eurasian steppe.
Indo-European migrations across the steppe.
Yeah, we're talking about vast movements of people stretching back millennia, people who likely originated further west and spread eastwards across the steppes deep into Central Asia, long, long before the rise of the Turkic and Mongolic peoples who would later come to dominate the area.
So who are we talking about here? Which peoples are associated with R1A and R1B on the ancient steppes, according to the source?
The source mentions groups like The Scythians, for example, famous nomadic warrior cultures from antiquity, their presence on the steppe is well documented from around the 9th century BCE onwards.
Okay, Scythians. Anyone else?
The Tocharians are another key group mentioned. They're known from their distinct Indo-European languages, which were unrelated to Iranian or Indic languages, and their presence in the Tarim Basin region that's in modern-day Xinjiang, China dates back at least to the first millennium BCE, probably earlier.
Wow, so deep history there.
Very deep. The source refers to these and other related ancient groups collectively as Caucasian peoples, meaning populations originating generally west of East Asia who inhabited Central Asia for many thousands of years. And crucially, they left a lasting genetic footprint, including these R1 markers, in the region.
And the source brings up a really vivid example of this presence, doesn't it? Something it calls a stark testament.
Ah, yes, you must mean the Tarim Basin mummies.
That's the one. Tell us about them.
They're incredible. These are remarkably well-preserved human remains, mummified naturally by the extremely dry desert conditions in the Tarim Basin in Xinjiang. Some of them date back as far as 4,000 years ago.
4,000 years, and what makes them relevant here?
What makes them so significant, besides their age and preservation, is that genetic analysis carried out on some of these mummies has often linked them precisely to these R1 haplogroups, particularly R1a.
So the genetics match this ancient Indo-European association.
Yes. And then there's their physical appearance, as preserved by the mummification process and described in the source material. It's quite striking, especially when you consider where they were found, deep in Central Asia.
What did they look like?
The source notes their description as having features like reddish blonde hair and European features.
Reddish blonde hair, European features, in the Tarim Basin thousands of years ago.
Exactly. This isn't just some minor detail. The source presents it as powerful visual and genetic confirmation of the populations with physical characteristics distinctly different from typical East Asian populations, and carrying these R1 haplogroups associated with ancient Indo-European migrations were living and thriving in the heart of Central Asia for millennia.
They were there long before the peoples we typically associate with the region today.
Long before. Before the Turkic peoples like the Uyghurs became prominent, and certainly long before the Mongol expansion brought influences from further east. These earlier people were an established part of the Central Asian landscape.
Okay, so let's connect these dots, as the source does. You've got these genetic markers, R1a and R1b, strongly linked to ancient Indo-European migrations across the steppe.
Right.
You have the historical and archaeological evidence of peoples like the Scythians and Tocharians carrying these markers and living on the steppe for millennia. And you have this vivid physical confirmation from the Tarim mummies showing people with associated features living deep in the region thousands of years ago. How does the source weave this together into a theory about the Borjigin clan?
Well, based on this confluence of evidence, the source proposes a hypothesis. It suggests that it is entirely plausible that the Borjigin clan, specifically the lineage of Genghis Khan, was not genetically typical of the broader Mongol tribes they eventually came to lead.
Okay, plausible how?
Plausible in the sense that they might have been an isolated elite lineage within the larger mix of steppe peoples.
Isolated and elite, suggesting maybe a different ancestral origin compared to the surrounding tribes.
Precisely. The theory posits that they could actually be descended from these earlier Indo-European inhabitants of the Eurasian steppe groups like the Scythians or Tocharians, or reloided peoples who had been in the region for thousands of years before the rise of the Mongols.
But wait, if they descended from these earlier groups, how did they become, well, Mongols, leading the Mongol tribes?
Ah, that's a key part of the hypothesis. This doesn't mean they remain culturally distinct forever. The source explains that over generations, as Turkic and eventually Mongolic peoples and languages became more dominant across Central Asia, the descendants of these older Indo-European groups, potentially including the Borjigin lineage, would likely have adopted the language, the customs, the nomadic lifestyle of their surrounding Turkic and Mongolic neighbors.
Assimilation, basically.
Exactly. Cultural and linguistic assimilation is a very common process throughout history, especially on the dynamic Eurasian steppe, where cultures constantly interacted and blended. However, and this is the crucial part of theory, while adopting the dominant culture, they could have retained a distinct genetic heritage, particularly in the male line, which is what Y-DNA tracks.
So they could look culturally Mongol, speak a Mongolic language, live like Mongols, but their paternal Y-DNA might trace back to a much older, non-East Asian source like R1a or R1b.
That's the theory. They lived among, interacted with, intermarried to some extent, and eventually rose to lead tribes who themselves likely had a predominantly East Asian genetic profile, perhaps rich in markers like C2 or haplogroup O, which is also common in East Asia.
So the picture emerging is of the Borjigin clan as possibly a genetically distinct, maybe even numerically small, elite group with ancient roots tracing back to earlier non-East Asian steppe inhabitants. Over centuries, they become culturally and linguistically Mongol, eventually rising to prominence and uniting the tribes under Genghis Khan.
That's the essence of the hypothesis presented in the source.
And if this genetic anomaly, this potential R1A or R1B link, could be definitively tied to the early Borjigin line, it would fundamentally reshape our understanding of their origins. It adds this incredible layer of complexity to the founding of the empire.
It absolutely would, and it's precisely at this point where the genetic perspective raises these fascinating possibilities about R1A and R1B as potential markers for this ancient lineage among the early Borjigin, that the source finds powerful, independent reinforcement from a completely different type of evidence.
Which is?
Historical descriptions. The source transitions here, moving from the incorruptible testimony of DNA, as it calls it, to the testimony of people who actually saw the early Khans and their family members, or recorded what was known about them at the time.
Okay, moving from the micro level of genes to the human level of historical accounts. And the source really stresses looking at primary source physical descriptions, right?
Exactly. Not later interpretations, not idealized portraits painted centuries after the fact, but accounts recorded by chroniclers who saw them firsthand, or, crucially, had access to reliable information from those who did. That proximity to the events and the people adds a significant layer of credibility compared to histories written much later.
And the source really zooms in on one chronicler in particular, someone who provides what it calls a vital clue. This is Rashid al-Din.
Rashid al-Din al-Hamadani. Yes, he's a key figure here. He was a Persian physician, originally Jewish but converted to Islam, who rose to become a historian and a very high-ranking official, a vizier, in fact, in the court of the Mongol Ilkhanate in Persia. This was during the late 13th and early 14th centuries.
So he was working for the Mongol rulers in Persia.
Yes, which is critical. He lived during a fascinating period of cultural fusion and political consolidation. His major historical work, which was actually commissioned by the Ilkhan Ghazan, one of the Mongol rulers of Perga, is the Jami al-Tawarki. That translates roughly as the Compendium of Chronicles. It's a monumental work of world history, really.
And what made his position and his work so uniquely valuable for understanding the Mongol royal family's history, according to the source?
His access. According to our source, Rashid al-Din's access was simply unparalleled. He wasn't just some scholar writing from a distance. As a vizier in the Ilkhanate court, he had direct interaction with the Mongol ruling elite, including descendants of Genghis Khan.
Wow.
And crucially, this is the really important part, he was granted access to the Mongols' own internal official histories. This included a legendary, almost mythical document known as the Altan Debtor.
The Golden Book. I've heard of that.
That's the one. It was supposedly the secret official chronicle of the Mongol royal family's origins, their genealogy, their history, passed down through generations. And tragically, it's now lost to history. We don't have it anymore.
So Rashid al-Din saw it or used it.
He used it. His Jami al-Tawarki drew directly from the Altan Debtor and other internal Mongol sources he was given access to. This makes his account one of our most precious windows into how the Mongols themselves recorded their lineage and the characteristics of their founders.
Okay, this isn't just rumor or legend then. This is a high-ranking historian working directly for the Mongol court in Persia with privileged access to their secret royal history book, the Altan Debtor. So what does this incredibly well-placed source, Rashid al-Din, actually say about the physical tenets of the ancestors of Genghis Khan, the members of the Borjigin family? Here's where, as the source notes, it gets really interesting.
This is the pivotal historical detail that the source emphasizes time again. Rashid al-Din, drawing on the Altan Debtor and potentially other internal Mongol sources or traditions known at court, explicitly described the ancestors of Genghis Khan, the foundational figures of the Borjigin clan, with very specific and quite unexpected features.
And those specific features were?
He described them, according to the source, as being tall, long-bearded men with reddish-brown hair and blue-green eyes.
Hold on. Tall, long-bearded, reddish-brown hair, and blue-green eyes.
That's the description recorded by Rashid al-Din based on his sources.
That is really striking. And it is decidedly not the image that typically comes to mind when we picture Genghis Khan or his family based on, later depictions or just general assumptions.
It's a profound divergence from the conventional image, absolutely. And the source points out an even more crucial detail from Rashid al-Din's account.
What's that?
He specifically notes that when Temujin, the boy who would become Genghis Khan, was born, he had this same appearance.
So it wasn't just a description of some mythical, distant ancestors from centuries ago.
No. According to Rashid al-Din's reporting of the Mongol tradition found in the Altan Dedder, this description applied to the very founder of the empire at the time of his birth.
Wow. Okay. That's specific.
It's incredibly specific. And there's another layer here, beyond just the physical description itself. The source highlights that Rashid al-Din also recorded that this physical type, these features, was considered a mark of his noble and authentic Borjigin ancestry.
A mark of nobility. So within the clan itself, this look wasn't seen as weird or foreign.
Quite the opposite, according to this account. It was seen as a sign of their genuine, high-status, elite lineage. It was inherent to their noble bloodline, something that distinguished them.
That detail feels incredibly significant for interpreting this. It suggests these traits weren't some kind of hidden secret or embarrassing anomaly to the early Borjigin clan. In their own cultural context, they seem to have viewed these features as part of what made them, part of their elite identity.
It certainly adds weight to the idea that the description wasn't just symbolic or misunderstood.
Now, the source does mention that many modern historians, when confronted with Rashid al-Din's description, tend to try and minimize it or explain it away somehow. What are the common arguments they use?
Well, the most frequent explanations you hear are, firstly, that the description might just be a mythological trope, a formulaic way of describing legendary heroes, giving them striking, perhaps exaggerated features like golden hair in European myths or other unusual traits in origin stories across cultures. It's seen as symbolic, not literal.
Okay, common storytelling device. What else?
Or secondly, they might suggest it was simply a misunderstanding on Rashid al-Din's part. Perhaps he was interpreting symbolic language literally, or maybe he mistranslated terms from Mongolian or Turkic sources into Persian.
Right, the lost in translation argument.
Exactly. But the source we're examining pushes back very strongly against these kinds of dismissals. It calls them, quite pointedly, an intellectually lazy dismissal of a crucial piece of eyewitness data.
Strong words. What's the counter-argument?
The source's counter-argument is really grounded in logic and context. It asks a pretty simple question. Why would a court historian, writing for the Mongol rulers themselves, with direct privileged access to their internal secret histories like the Altan Dedder, invent physical features that so radically diverge from the appearance of the surrounding populace, and presumably the adult rulers he actually saw walking around the court?
Yeah, that doesn't make much sense. If Rashid al-Din wrote that the founder of the dynasty had red hair and blue eyes, when everyone knew the current Ilkhan princes looked typically East Asian, wouldn't his credibility just be instantly shot within the court itself?
Precisely. It would be an obvious, glaring contradiction to anyone who had ever seen a Borjigin prince, or even just a typical Mongol soldier or commoner at the time. It risks making him look foolish or like he didn't know what he was talking about.
So what's the more logical conclusion, according to the source?
The source argues that the more logical conclusion is that Rashid al-Din was recording an uncomfortable fact. The Mongol royal family looked different because they were different. Their lineage was distinct. He wasn't inventing a myth for poetic effect. He was likely reporting, as faithfully as he could, what was recorded in their own revered histories, or what was known within the inner circles about the founder's birth characteristics and ancestral appearance.
Okay, that really compellingly ties the specific historical description back to the possibility of a distinct lineage, maybe linked to those R1 haplogroups we talked about earlier. The genetics suggest a potential origin. The history provides a description that seems to match.
The alignment is certainly suggestive.
But then the obvious question pops up immediately. If the early Borjigins, including potentially Genghis Khan at birth, had these striking features, tall, reddish-brown hair, blue-green eyes, why isn't that the image we see widely among later Mongol rulers, say in Persia, where Rashid al-Din was, or in Yuan, China? And why don't we see those traits commonly among the general populations across the former empire today?
It's a fair question. And the source provides a really simple, straightforward, and historically very common answer to that.
Which?
Intermarriage. Specifically, intermarriage with the vast populations they conquered. Remember, the Mongol Empire wasn't just geographically vast, it was incredibly diverse, ethnically and culturally. It stretched across Asia, incorporating Persians, numerous Turkic groups, Chinese, Russians, various peoples of the Caucasus, Eastern Europeans. The list goes on.
So, as the Borjigin ruling family established these different dynasties in different regions, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Yuan in China, the Golden Horde in the West.
Exactly. As they settled in and ruled over these diverse populations, they inevitably began to intermarry with the local aristocracies, with other elite families, and just generally with the populations they governed. This happened over generations.
And the genetic effect of that.
The source explains it as a natural dilution of the original genetic stock. Over subsequent generations, as the descendants of Genghis Khan mixed with Persian, Turkic, Chinese, Slavic, and many other populations, the original distinct genetic heritage of the very early Borjigin clan would have become increasingly diluted.
Makes sense.
Those specific physical traits associated with that original lineage, the height, the reddish-brown hair, the blue-green eyes, would naturally become less and less common with each passing generation. Eventually, they would either disappear entirely or become extremely rare within the larger, much more genetically mixed populations influenced by the empire. This would include the later branches of the Borjigin family themselves, who ruled the successor states.
So, the disappearance of the traits isn't evidence against the original description. It's actually the expected outcome of empire building and generational intermixing.
That's precisely the argument. It's a standard process of genetic admixture following conquest and settlement.
So, putting it together, the genetic evidence pointing towards R1 AR1B markers associated with older Indo-European populations who lived on the steppe for millennia, combined with the very specific detailed historical descriptions from a uniquely credible primary source like Rashid al-Din, drawing on Mongol records, they seem to paint a consistent, albeit really surprising, picture of the early Borjigin lineage.
They do seem to converge, don't they? They powerfully reinforce each other. The genetics suggest the potential for an older, distinct lineage with non-East Asian roots. The history provides a physical description that aligns remarkably well with the appearance often associated with those older lineages present on the steppe.
It feels less like a random coincidence and more like two independent lines of evidence pointing in a similar, unexpected direction.
That's certainly how the source presents the connection.
Which naturally leads us right to the next really crucial question. If this genetic evidence suggesting R1 links and this detailed historical description from Rashid al-Din both exist and have presumably been available to scholars for some time, why isn't this picture the picture of a potentially distinct, maybe even Caucasian-featured early Borjigin lineage the standard narrative? Why are we still, by and large, presented with that generic East Asian image of Genghis Khan?
Right. Why the disconnect between this evidence, as presented by the source, and the common understanding? And this is where the source brings in that critical factor, the politics of history.
Oh, okay. So it wasn't just forgotten, it was actively shaped.
According to the source, yes. The answer lies with the winners who rewrote history. Or, perhaps more accurately, the major successor states that emerged after the initial unified Mongol Empire started to fragment in the later 13th century. Their political needs, the source argues, shaped the historical narrative we inherited.
And who are these key successor states? Whose needs are we talking about?
The source highlights two of the most prominent and influential ones. First, you have the Yuan dynasty in China, founded by Kublai Khan, who was, of course, a grandson of Genghis Khan.
Right, the Mongol dynasty that ruled China.
Exactly. And the Yuan rulers faced this fundamental challenge. How do you legitimize your rule over China? China was this ancient civilization with its own incredibly deep-seated traditions of governance, imperial ideology, the mandate at heaven, all of that.
Yeah, how do you, as foreign conquerors, convince the Chinese populace and elites that you're the rightful emperors?
Well, the source explains that the Yuan strategy was largely about assimilation, or at least appearing to assimilate. They sought to legitimize their rule by presenting the Khans as authentic sons of heaven, minimizing their foreignness. The concept of the son of heaven was absolutely central to Chinese imperial ideology.
So they needed to look like they fit the Chinese model of emperorship.
Precisely. To be seen as legitimate rulers in that specific Chinese context, the Khans needed to be portrayed as integrating into Chinese civilization, inheriting its mandate, rather than simply imposing foreign rule upon it. Now imagine trying to do that while also emphasizing an ancestral link to Caucasian steppe tribes, groups historically viewed through a very particular, often negative or barbarian lens by traditional Chinese civilization.
Yeah, that would completely undermine the son of heaven narrative. It would scream foreign, not legitimate inheritor.
It would be the absolute opposite of their goal. You would underscore their foreignness, making their claim to the mandate of heaven much harder for the Chinese populace and the traditional scholar officials to accept. So for the Yuan court, any emphasis on a distinct, non-East Asian, non-Chinese aligned ancestry for the founding family was politically toxic.
Okay. Politically inconvenient truth number one. What about the other major successor state?
The source points to the Ilkhanate in Persia, founded by another of Genghis Khan's grandsons, Hulagu Khan. The Ilkhans ruled over Persia, Iraq, Anatolia, the Caucasus. And over time, they faced their own integration challenge. Eventually, the Ilkhan rulers converted to Islam and increasingly assimilated into Persian Turkic culture.
So becoming part of the Islamic Persianate world.
Yes, their long-term survival and their ability to govern this vast, complex region effectively depended heavily on gaining the acceptance and cooperation of the predominantly Muslim, Persian, and Turkic populations and elites they ruled over.
And much like the Yuan situation, I imagine emphasizing a distant, non-Islamic, non-Persian, non-Turkic, maybe Caucasian ancestry wouldn't exactly help with that integration process either.
Probably not. Again, according to the source's argument, an ancestral link to these distinct ancient steppe groups, especially if it implied a non-Islamic or pre-Islamic origin that was also distinct from the Turkic peoples who were already a major part of the Western steppe and Middle Eastern world, would have been a politically inconvenient truth for the Ilkhanate as they sought to embed themselves within the Persianate world and solidify their rule after converting to Islam.
Interesting. So in these two major successor states ruling over vastly different cultural context, China and Persia, the underlying motivation was actually quite similar: create a historical narrative that smoothed over the potentially distinct origins of the ruling family, make them appear less foreign, more aligned with the dominant populations and cultures they now governed.
That's the powerful argument this source puts forward. This inconvenient truth. The potential for a distinct, non-typically East Asian ancestry for the founder's family, supported by genetics and early historical accounts, wasn't necessarily dealt with by outright blatant fabrication. Instead, the source suggests it was handled by being systematically scrubbed from official accounts.
Scrubbed? How?
Histories were commissioned, written, or perhaps subtly rewritten. Earlier accounts, like maybe even parts of Rashid al-Din's work that highlighted these features too strongly, might have been downplayed, reinterpreted, or just quietly ignored over time. The emphasis shifted to serve the new political realities of the Yuan dynasty trying to look Chinese, and the Ilkhanate trying to look integrated into the Persian Islamic world.
And the end result of all this systematic scrubbing, this reshaping of the narrative over centuries?
The source argues that the historical narrative got flattened, simplified. The specific, detailed, and quite striking description of the early Borjigin family that we find recorded by chroniclers like Rashid al-Din, that tall, blue-eyed, red-haired image that was explicitly linked to their noble ancestry, was replaced with the generic Asiatic warrior we know today.
The image that fit better everywhere.
Exactly. This generic, simplified image served the political needs of the successor states far better than the more complex, potentially inconvenient reality captured by those earlier, more direct sources. It allowed the Yuan to project an image more palatable to the Chinese, and the Ilkhanate to project one more aligned with the Persianate world. It erased the uncomfortable distinctiveness.
So the common image we have isn't necessarily a complete invention out of thin air, but it's more like a heavily edited, politically motivated portrayal. A version that, over centuries, effectively obscured a potentially fascinating and really significant part of the story of the empire's founders.
That's the conclusion the source strongly points towards, yes. The accepted picture of Genghis Khan and the Borjigin clan is, according to this analysis, to a significant extent a product of later historical engineering by the empires that inherited his legacy. It wasn't necessarily a full reflection of the earliest generation of the ruling family itself.
Okay, let's try and unpack all of this now. Let's bring together the different threads we've pulled from the source material throughout this deep dive, because it feels like we've covered genetics, history, politics.
It's definitely a multi-layered argument. And when you synthesize the evidence discussed, the genetic picture on one hand and the historical descriptions on the other, a very different and, much more complex picture of the Borjigin origin starts to emerge, at least according to the source's re-examination.
Right. We began by questioning that standard genetic story, the one that focuses almost exclusively on Haplogroup C2 as the Genghis Khan lineage.
Correct. And the source makes a pretty strong case, we heard, that while C2 is undeniably widespread and absolutely linked to the empire's expansion, it primarily represents the legacy of the Mongol armies. It's the signature of the horde's massive impact and all the population mixing that followed. It acts, potentially, as that genetic smokescreen we talked about.
Okay, so C2 is the horde, maybe not the founder's specific origin line. Then we explored the alternative genetic markers the source points to, R1A and R1B.
And we saw their established association with ancient Indo-European migrations onto the Eurasian steppe, a presence confirmed by really compelling evidence like those Tarim Basin mummies, which show that people with associated physical traits were living right there in the region millennia ago.
So these persistent Indo-European R1 haplogroups in the region, as the source calls them, provide a clear potential origin for a distinct lineage.
Exactly, a distinct lineage like potentially the ruling Borjigin family, suggesting they could have been an elite group with roots among these much earlier inhabitants who later adopted Mongol culture but retained this older genetic link.
And then, crucially, we layered in the historical descriptions. We found incredibly powerful and really specific reinforcement in the accounts of chroniclers like Rashid al-Din.
Yes, someone with that privileged access to the Mongol royal family's own records, including the lost Ultan Better. That gives his testimony unique weight.
And those unequivocal historical descriptions provide the visual confirmation, almost, that aligns with the genetic possibility. He described the early Borjigin family, and importantly, Temujin himself at birth, with features like being tall, having reddish-brown hair, blue-green eyes. And these features, he said, were explicitly linked by them to their noble and authentic ancestry.
The convergence is striking.
It really is.
Yeah.
So when you connect those dots, the genetic patterns hinting at an older, non-typically East Asian lineage, the striking historical descriptions from a highly credible primary source that seem to align with the physical appearance associated with those older lineages, and then you factor in the clear political motivations of the major successor states to downplay anything that made the founders seem too foreign. It starts to build a very coherent, compelling, alternative picture.
It does build a consistent narrative based on the evidence presented. And the source is quite direct, quite bold about the conclusion it draws from pulling all this combined evidence together.
Which is?
It states, quite plainly, the idea of a Caucasian Genghis Khan is not a fantasy.
Not a fantasy.
Okay.
And the source's confidence for saying that rests on?
It rests on the argument that this is a theory grounded in genetic and historical data. It emphasizes that this isn't based on just speculation or later legends or wishful thinking. It's built upon specific pieces of evidence drawn from seemingly disparate fields, population genetics on one side, primary source historical accounts on the other, that when you view them together, seem to tell a consistent story, a story that radically challenges the conventional narrative.
And the source is equally clear about why it thinks this compelling evidence, this alternative picture, hasn't become the widely accepted view in mainstream history. Why isn't this taught in schools?
It concludes that this is largely because it radically challenges the comfortable, victor-approved version of the past. It represents evidence that has, perhaps not always maliciously, but certainly effectively, been deliberately ignored or systematically explained away over centuries. Why? Because it didn't fit the simplified narrative that the later, more established empires wanted or needed to promote about their founders.
Wow. This whole deep dive really hammers home how historical narratives aren't just found like artifacts, they are constructed, they're built. And that construction process can sometimes, whether intentionally or unintentionally, bury fascinating truths that just don't fit the desired story of those who hold power later on.
Exactly. And the source makes a powerful call, implicitly at least, for acknowledging this possibility. It suggests it is time to acknowledge the evidence that has been hiding in plain sight. It's a potent reminder for all of us when we look at history that our understanding of even the most major historical figures and events can be profoundly altered by simply looking carefully at all the available data, especially parts that seem anomalous or inconvenient at first glance.
It truly makes you reconsider everything you thought you knew about that iconic image of Genghis Khan and the origins of the Mongol Empire. It certainly prompts you to think much more critically about the sources of historical knowledge we rely on and who might have shaped them and why.
It broadens the perspective significantly.
Yeah. So to wrap up then, we started this deep dive by looking at that very familiar, universally accepted image of Genghis Khan and daring to ask, is that the full story.
Mm.
We dove deep into the genetic evidence, moving beyond the widely cited C2 haplogroup, which our source argues mainly represents the legacy of the armies, and acts like a genetic smokescreen to explore the potential significance of R1A and R1B haplogroups.
Markers strongly associated with ancient Indo-European migrations across the steppe, with a long history in the region confirmed by things like the Tarim mummies.
Exactly. Showing people with associated physical traits were right there millennia before the rise of the Mongols. Then we layered in the historical accounts, finding surprising and really powerful reinforcement in those specific eyewitness-based descriptions from chroniclers like Rashid al-Din.
Especially his access to the Mongol royal zone records, the Altendetter, which makes his testimony about their appearance, reddish-brown hair, blue-green eyes, linked to nobility uniquely valuable and aligned with the genetic possibilities.
And finally, we explored the source's argument for why this potentially distinct ancestry might have been downplayed, obscured from the standard historical narrative over time. We looked at how successor states, like the Yuan dynasty in China and the Ilkhanate in Persia, had clear political reasons to present the Khans as less foreign, more integrated.
Leading to that systematic scrubbing of inconvenient truths and the creation of the more generic, politically convenient image that has dominated our view for centuries.
So the key takeaway here isn't just about, what color Genghis Khan's hair might have been. It's much bigger than that. It's about understanding the profound complexity of human ancestry, especially in incredibly dynamic crossroads regions like the Eurasian steppe, which saw waves upon waves of migration and cultural exchange for millennia.
Absolutely. And it's also a powerful demonstration of how historical narratives themselves are shaped, often by forces completely unrelated to historical accuracy. It shows how crucial it is for us, as people trying to understand the past, to look critically at all the available evidence, especially the details that seem anomalous or the ones that got conveniently overlooked by later generations.
Because examining those overlooked details, as this source attempts to do, can fundamentally change our perception of even the most iconic figures and the most foundational events in history. It really does prompt you to think critically about the filters through which we receive our history. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? What else that we accept as just fact might actually be a simplified, politically convenient version of a much more complex, maybe even contradictory reality.
It's a crucial question to keep asking. And maybe let's leave our listeners with one final thought, picking up on that point the source made about the early Borjigin clan themselves, before the empire. If that physical appearance, those striking features Rashid al-Din described, the reddish-brown hair, the blue-green eyes, if that look was explicitly considered by the early Khans as a mark of their noble and authentic Borjigin ancestry, what does that tell us? What does it suggest about the values, the identity, the self-perception of the Borjigin clan in their own time before the empire changed everything?
I mean, how they saw themselves.
Yeah, it suggests that they themselves viewed these physical traits not as foreign or strange, but as something distinct and inherently tied to their elite status. It perhaps hints at a consciousness within the clan of having a lineage that was different from the surrounding tribes, a lineage they saw not as something to hide, but as something that actually defined their nobility and their right to lead. Something to ponder, perhaps, long after this discussion ends.
Definitely something to think about the next time you see that familiar image of the conqueror on horseback.